In part one, we laid out Rowe's argument from evil. And in part two, we're going to look more at criticisms. We considered the direct response. And here we're going to consider an indirect response to his argument. Now, in order to start the video here, let's make sure that we understand the argument. So once again, this is from part one. Rowe's argument from evil goes like this. There exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being, and we'll just call this being God, could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. So this would be unjustified suffering, right? Suffering without a purpose. And his example was a suggestion of a fawn who got burned in a forest fire and suffers for a couple days before finally succumbing. Now, God would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless God could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. So the second premise says there would be a reason, a purpose for suffering that exists. The first premise says there is no reason, therefore we conclude that God does not exist. Now, this is an inductive argument. The premises give us reason to believe the conclusion, says Rowe. So, how do we respond now? Second possible response here, instead of a direct attack on the argument, an indirect attack. Now, remember, the Rowe suggested direct attack could take two forms, attacking premise two or premise one, of course. If attacking premise two, Rowe said very few, if any, theists do that, but I suggested many do. There's an overarching purpose, maybe, for suffering, but maybe not individual purposes for individual suffering. And so that would be a reason to question premise two. Premise one, the reason to question that would be primarily our limited cognitive abilities and our awareness of what's going on. And so who's to say that there might not be a reason for any particular given suffering, even if we can't even see it, even if we couldn't even imagine it, God may have a reason for that suffering. Okay, those were the direct attacks. Now we want to move on to the indirect attack. And Rowe says this is modeled on the G.E. Moore shift, a response to skepticism, where Moore believes that he has a hand in front of him stronger than he believes the premises in an argument for skepticism. And so that was his basic response. Now, if your premises, so here's the principle, right? If your premises lead to a conclusion of which the negation is believed to a stronger degree than the premises, in the case of Moore with skepticism, the conclusion was your hand does not exist, and he believes the negation of that more strongly than any of the premises, that his hand does exist, then one or more of the premises must be false. And so that's the response. Now, how is this a response to this argument from evil? Well, the basic idea is that the theist is going to say, look, I'm more confident that God exists than I am that there are pointless evils. And that we're focusing in on premise one there. And so there must not be any pointless evil, right? So an example of this, let's take this again outside the context of our argument from evil. Suppose you have a conditional if P then Q, all right? And two people are on different sides of a topic, but they both agree with that conditional, if P then Q. Now, one person could say P. So let's have P be it's worth doing. So if P, if it's worth doing, and Q be it's worth doing well. So if it's worth doing, it's worth doing well. So a boss might say, look, if it's worth doing well. And the boss believes P, that it's worth doing. And so the boss concludes it's worth doing well. Whereas a worker might think to themselves, well, wait a minute, it's really not worth doing well. So not Q, therefore not P. Therefore, it's not worth doing, right? And so they might agree on the conditional, if P then Q, but they disagree on the conclusion that you might draw from them. One believes not Q, the other believes P. All right, now how does that, so that's what we've talked through there. How does that fit in with this indirect attack? So Rowe oddly, formalizes the atheist argument form. He says, well, we have P, we have Q, therefore we believe R, and they are somewhat, there's some reason to construct the formalization this way. First premise, then there's this second premise, and then we draw the conclusion, and there's not that direct connection. So we have P, Q, R, and then the theist responds, well, not R, right? I don't believe that God does not exist. And Q, therefore, there must not be any pointless evil, therefore not P. Now, it would be nice if we had a formal construction of this. I mean, clearly, if you had an argument P, Q, therefore R, that's an invalid argument anyway. So probably a better way to do this would be P is there is pointless evil, and Q is God exists. And the idea built in with premise 2 is if P, then Q. And the atheist is going to say, since there is pointless evil, therefore God does not exist, right? But the theist might look at the if P, then not Q. If there is pointless evil, then God does not exist. The theist may affirm Q. Well, I know God exists, therefore there must not be any pointless evil. So they both agree on the conditional. In this case, it's if P, then not Q, right? If there is pointless suffering, God does not exist. Whereas the atheist, in this case, Rowe, affirms P, the first premise. He concludes that the God does not exist. So the theist takes the other route. This is the indirect route. It just says, well, I don't believe that conclusion, so there must be something wrong with the premise. Now, here, what I've done is I've constructed both of these arguments are now valid arguments, right? One person's modus tollens is another person's modus ponens, or however you choose to say it. The question is then, since they're both valid, which one is sound? So that's the next approach we need to take. Now, before we get there, Rowe has a significant and substantive kind of train of thought that isn't directly related to the argument, but is certainly worthwhile. And in fact, this is something that Rowe is prominently known for, his friendly atheism. So he describes friendly atheism. He considers himself a friendly atheist. Now, this is like unfriendly atheists. So Rowe is acknowledging there are unfriendly atheists, and they would claim that only the first argument is rational on that previous screen. The only rational argument is the one that concludes that God does not exist. It's irrational to reject the argument. And this would include prominent people, kind of one foot in philosophy, but mostly outside of philosophy. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, who is a philosopher. These are sometimes called the four horsemen of the new atheism movement. And those are unfriendly atheists. So they think God does not exist, and there's really no hope for arguing against their view. But Rowe is not in that camp. Rowe supports friendly atheism. And the idea here is, although the first argument is thought to be correct, that's the one that he believes is sound, he says the second argument that I've presented on that previous slide is rational. So it's rational for the theist to make that claim. Well, I already know that God exists, therefore there must be something wrong with one of the premises. And Rowe agrees that either take on the conditional, whether you put a, when you have if P then not Q, whether you put a P added to it, that would be rational, or whether you say no, Q, that would also be rational. And so either approach is within the bound of reason. Now, how can he say this, right? Now, certainly some atheists don't like this approach, and it seems odd to many people. Wait a minute, you're saying the theist is rational, but you just gave a great argument for atheism. So let's explore this a little bit more. Why does he take the view of friendly atheism? And his rationale that he provides is, he says, look, sometimes a person might be rationally justified in believing a false proposition. And that would be what's going on with the theist in this case, from Rowe's perspective. So imagine that you're in a plane crash off the coast, and you survived the plane crash, but on the news they report that everybody on it died. Now, people, your family or other people hearing about this, have a rational basis for believing that you have died. Of course, you don't have that. You're surviving. You're out there in the ocean hoping for a rescue. Or to go back quite a ways in the past, in the 2000 United States election for president, one prominent news network, CBS News, reported that Gore had won the election, and he won because he won the Florida vote. And so a lot of people were rationally justified in believing that Gore had won the election, when in fact it was Bush who won that election, not Gore. Other cases abound. Someone who has car keys for a Ford that you see, and they always have that Ford car key on them, but they don't in fact drive a Ford. They're borrowing it, or they just keep it as a memento because their dad drove a Ford, but they in fact drive a Chevy or something like that, whereas somebody else could see the evidence, conclude that it's rational so it's rational to believe the person drives a Ford when in fact they do not. So we have all these reasons. Of course, many other cases abound that somebody might be rationally justified in believing a false proposition. Okay, so the friendly atheist thinks that the theist has some rational justification for a false belief, for the belief that God exists. Now, that may be through other arguments for the existence of God. Maybe the theist is convinced by arguments for the existence of God. Maybe there are religious experiences that the theist has. Maybe there are some explanatory hypotheses that are plausible for a number of things that the person has experienced. So Rowe suggests all kinds of things are potentially providing a basis for the theist to be rational in their belief. So let's think about this just a little bit more. Considering the variety of situations that people are in, Rowe says, considering the vast experiences that people have, the evidence that they're exposed to, it's plausible to think that there are many people who are justified in believing that God exists. Now, note that, just to be clear here, the friendly atheist must also think that he or she is in a better position to know the truth of the matter here, right? So Rowe is being a friendly atheist, but he says, look, he has to think that he's in a better position to make this judgment that God does not exist than the theist, right? In order to be rational in his beliefs. And so, that's a view that he takes. He has to say, I'm in a better epistemic position than the theist is. And of course, he has an argument for that, the argument he just provided. Okay, so what criticisms might be raised? we consider the indirect attack, and Rose is kind of okay with that, says, well, a person may be rational, but wrong, and he's in a better position. Of course, a friendly theist, right, a theist who says you might be rationally justified as an atheist, might respond in kind. And of course, they also would be thinking, but I'm in a better position. You don't know what I know. If you knew what I knew and had my experiences, then you would have belief in God. You would be rationally justified in believing that God exists. Now, as a reminder, of course, there were the direct attacks against the argument, but we're just thinking about following up on this line of thought and criticism. Now, Rowe does seem to include, here's another criticism, an assumption of utilitarianism, right? That God has to balance out any pain with more good. And there are certainly many reasons to reject utilitarianism. So if somebody's not a utilitarianism, but the argument's assuming a form of utilitarianism, then that might be a problem there. And I'll just close on a very particular, unique criticism directed at Rowe individually, and that is the idea, how does this compare with his discussion of the cosmological argument? Now, if you're not familiar with that, one of the premises that he gave when he was criticizing the cosmological argument was the principle of sufficient reason, that there must be a reason for any positive fact whatsoever. And he said, well, you can't prove that to be true. You can't know that it's true. And since the argument hinges on it, we should reject the argument, even if it's plausible to believe that it's true. Now, here he's going in the opposite direction, right? Here he's saying we can't prove his first premise. He said that. He said, but it's, plausible, it's rational to accept the first premise of this argument from evil. Therefore, it's rational to believe the conclusion. So he uses two very different approaches, right? In the criticism of the cosmological argument, he holds it to the standard of, well, you got to be able to prove that the premise is true in order to accept the argument. Here, when he's talking about the argument from evil, he says, well, if it's rational to believe the premises, then it's rational to believe the conclusion. Now, I think he's right in this case, on principle, that if you're rationally accepting the premise, then you ought to accept the conclusion, right? As long as it's a decent argument. Now, if somebody, just to clarify one other thing, he wrote those two articles within a year from one another. So it's not like one was early in his career and then he changed his view on assessing arguments and wrote the other one later in his career. I'm guessing he would go with this route, and he might have some revision to his assessment of the cosmological argument that would be more consistent with the approach that he takes in this argument. In any case, that's Rowe and his friendly atheism and his argument from evil in the inductive form.